incorrect wire size for a breaker. An incorrect wire size or gauge is a common observation by a home inspector when inspecting 15 and 20 amp breakers at the electrical panel board. An incorrect wire gauge may be found at any breaker. An example of an incorrect wire gauge is where a 14 gauge wire is connected to a 20 amp breaker. This is a defect because of the size of the breaker, 20 amp, it's too big for the size of the wire, 14 gauge. A 14 gauge wire is the minimum size for a 15 amp breaker. The size of the wire connected to the 15 amp breaker is permitted to be bigger. To put it another way, a 15 amp breaker is the biggest size breaker for a 14 gauge wire. They are commonly found to be correctly connected to each other, a 15 amp breaker and a 14 gauge wire. Please refer to the 2021 IRC Table E3705.3.3 within the course for overcurrent production rating for small conductors that home inspectors can keep in mind when checking for incorrect wire gauges for certain breakers. Please refer to the table within the course titled 2021 IRC Table E3705.3.3 NEC 240.4D Overcurrent Protection Rating for Small Conductors. This shows what home inspectors can keep in mind when checking for incorrect wire gauges for certain breakers. Looking at the table, we see that a 12 gauge wire is the minimum size for a 20 amp breaker. The wire gauge is permitted to be bigger than 12 gauge when connected to a 20 amp breaker. A 10 gauge wire is the minimum for 30 amp breakers. You can't have a wire smaller than a 10 gauge when it is connected to a 30 amp breaker. A wire gauge that is smaller than the minimum size for the breaker is vulnerable to overheating. Oversizing the wire for the breaker is allowed. If the bar wire end is visible, a home inspector may be able to observe and determine the wire gauge, but just seeing only the insulated wire can make identification more difficult. A home inspector should never insert a potentially conductive instrument into the electrical panel in order to take a measurement of the wire gauge. If an inspector uses a wire gauge measurement device, it must be tested and confirmed to be non-conductive. Different manufacturers have different thicknesses of the plasticized insulation on the wire, which may make an inspector look for other clues to the wire gauge, particularly the labeling on the wire itself. Table E3705.5.3 of the 2021 IRC, often referred to alongside the NEC, National Electrical Code Section 240.4D, pertains to the overcurrent protection ratings for specific types of conductors in residential applications. This table is crucial for home inspectors as it assists in determining whether the overcurrent protection devices, like circuit breakers or fuses, are correctly sized for the conductors they protect. Please refer to the table within the course. The main intent of the NEC 240.4D is to provide standard overcurrent protection for conductors to prevent them from carrying more current than they are rated for, which could lead to overheating and potentially cause a fire hazard. The NEC has established maximum overcurrent protection rating for certain conductor sizes, and this table translates these limitations into a format that can be easily followed during inspections. Here's a simplified explanation of what the table includes. Conductor size. This column lists the sizes of the conductors, usually in American wire gauge, AWG, or KC mil. Conductor size is a critical factor in determining the appropriate overcurrent protection. Copper conductors. Since copper is the most common conductive material used for electrical wiring, this column will specify the maximum overcurrent protection rating for copper conductors of different sizes. Aluminum or copper-clad aluminum conductors. This column addresses the maximum overcurrent protection rating for aluminum or copper-clad aluminum conductors, which have different properties than pure copper conductors and therefore require different considerations for overcurrent protection. Home inspectors can use this table to check that each circuit has the appropriate size breaker or fuse. If, for example, a 12-gauge copper wire is protected by a 30-ampere breaker, this would be a defect, since the table indicates that the maximum overcurrent protection for a 12-gauge copper conductor is 20 amperes. Exceeding this limit could cause the conductor to overheat under overload conditions. For home inspectors, knowledge of the specifics in these tables is helpful for educating homeowners on the safety aspects of their electrical system, including the various types of wiring commonly installed in homes.